Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. The political discourse of Hindutva has dramatically altered the political landscape of India and has redefined identities of subaltern castes. The recently released book, Maya, Modi and Azad, Dalit Politics in Time of Hindutva, digs deeper into how the Dalit discourse has responded to the changing socio-political context. To discuss the changing Dalit political landscape, we have with us the book's co-author, Dr. Sajjan Kumar. Dr. Sajjan Kumar is fellow at the Prime Minister Museum and Library, New Delhi. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talks, sir. So let's dive right into the question. Electoral politics in India today seems to be dominated by the discourse of Hindutva, at least in the northern part of India. And it seems that the ideological plurality of India's democracy and the voices of the subaltern castes, Dalits, OBCs, the lower OBCs, minorities, and for that matter, women seems to be fading away. So to look back at the past, how do you describe the rise of Dalit leaders like Mayawati and Kashi Ram, and how were they able to first unite, mobilize, and then turn that into electoral success?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Let's get back slightly more around the freedom struggle. And by 1930s, it was clear that the politics of numbers had started. The decadal census has created a sense of numerical identities, where minority, majority, you have depressed classes, scheduled caste, and then now Dalits, and multiple identities. So around that time, the Congress-led freedom struggle was conscious that it should be representative of all the voices and representation through representative from the community. So we do find that what we call today is the Dalit question, that time it was a depressed classes question or the ex-untouchable, etc. emerged. And the most, there were two competing frames which were competing to frame the Dalit question. One was the Gandhian frame, which wanted to link the question of Dalit community with a larger Hindu society and by extension Indian society. So it was the integrationist frame. To them, the question of the problem of untouchability was the problem of caste Hindus, not the Dalits, and therefore it was through various reforms. On the other hand, a very critical take emerged, and it was championed primarily by Dr. Ambedkar, which was more about asserting the autonomy away from the Hindu community. So initial phase was about the reform, but then it emerged about the autonomous Dalit politics, which needs to assert about its spatial and identity-based autonomy from rest of the Hindu society. So there were the competing discourse. So until 1980s, we find that leaders through leaders like Sajjan Ram and others, it was the Gandhian frame of integrating Dalit with the rest of the Hindu society and other parts that dominated. But as we know, 1980s is a very important decade, not only for Indian politics but also in a global frame, because late 60s to 70s we find wherein you find the age of anger, assertion, multiple movements are happening, but overall the theme is about the class, more like if you see students movement in the West, or it's about women's movement, feminism entering into a more assertive radical phase, etc., etc. But overall it's the language of the class that is still holding on the semantics of politics. But late 70s, say for example 79, we have Islamic revolution in Iran, we have Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and thereby we also have the Mujahideens who are emerging. Then it is also the time when Sheikh Abdullah is coming and trying to make a comeback in Kashmir. And in Kashmir we find suddenly some of the autonomous voices, separatist voices, they start gaining the ground. It's all late 70s and early 80s. Side by side within India, you see Kashmir problem is there, but at the same time, it is a time when a leader like a new generation of Ambedkarite leaders have emerged. So this is the second birth of Ambedkar, because it is the time when Congress model of Dalit politics, Gandhian frame is collapsing, and a more radical, assertive, autonomous Ambedkarite leadership is emerging. So you have Kashiram, who is ideologically trained in Maharashtra, in Pune, comes back to Punjab, tries to implement it, very radical and assertive and autonomous, then goes to UP because Punjabi doesn't succeed. And thereby they start calling all the integrationist Dalits like Jagjeevan Ram and Ram Vilas Paswan, etc., as the stooges of the fragmented caste system. So any Dalit who is in the mainstream party, say Congress or socialist parties or various regional parties, who is not specifically talking about the centrality of the Dalit question as being the agents of the caste Hindus. This is one departure. That is also the time wherein Congress makes a comeback after emergency, but the Nehruvian consensus or the hegemony, psychological hegemony of the Congress which was there on the society is collapsing, and therefore there is a vacuum. Mandal report has been submitted, you have Shah Bano case, you have a Hindutva movement that is emerging. So 80s is the crucial decade because it is 1980s when politics in India and across the globe effectively takes an identitarian turn. Identities were always there, but they were not the front driver. They did not have the centrality the way identities acquired the centrality in 1980s, and India also reflected that. So that is why in 1980s you see we are witnessing a new phase of Dalit assertion, new phase of Dalit politics, and new phase of Dalit discourse. Discourse means we have politics, economy, social and cultural aspect, and which is talking about lived experience, which is talking about an autonomous Dalit experience, which is talking about who is an authentic Dalit. If you are not following a particular frame, as Kashiram said, that you can be an authentic Dalit, that was implicit, if and only if you are following a very Puritan Ambedkarite frame. If you go for a mainstream Dalit discourse, you would be categorized and dubbed as an stooge of the Brahmanical system. So this is also the time when the authentic identities are coming to the fore, and that is very appealing. And that leads to a consolidated phase of Dalit politics. Electorally, it did not succeed in most of the states, but it is in UP that we find that the roots of a consolidated, pan-state, autonomous, assertive, Ambedkarite Dalit politics is laid down in 1980s, and thereafter we see that since 1990s up to 2010s we find that that discourse succeeds effectively electorally in UP, but in terms of civil society, in terms of assertion, in terms of the claim to represent across India. Something that we find, and later we can talk about that how since 2010s we find that consolidated, state-centric, unified, autonomous Dalit discourse starts witnessing a decline. So that's a shift. 1980s is the decade of consolidation of a pan-state Dalit identity in politics.
To talk of today's political environment, it seems that Hindus are united against all others. So, do Dalits form an important part of the new Hindutva discourse?
They do. First of all, Dalit coming to the Hindutva discourse is not entirely new or unique. There have been sections of Dalit who have been voting to Janasangh. There have been important Dalit leaders who were associated with Janasangh and other Hindutva outfits. If we take, for example, Hindu Mahasabha, Savarkarite entire framework was about collapsing the caste barriers and uniting the Hindus. If we take RSS, after second head of the RSS, Guru Golwarkar, the third head, Balasaheb Devras, he consciously started a subaltern project. So Samajik Samrasta, etc. you see. So 1970s onward, there is a conscious attempt. There is also by 1980s one of the most powerful general secretary of the BJP, then SN Govindacharya. He talks about social engineering, that how OBCs and Dalits have to be the new core. So there has been conscious attempt to include them, but the Hindutva discourse was not succeeding the way it is succeeding now. Now, coming to the question, do we see that now we are finding a consolidated Hindu identity wherein Dalits are also the core? It also begs the question, how do we see the relation between the subalterns, OBCs and Dalits, and the secular? Now, looking from the framing of the debate from the vantage point of the left and liberal discourse has always pitted secularism vis-a-vis Brahmanical system. So, the assumption was that subaltern and secular are always one and the same. Now, that itself could not have been problematic if we understand the notion of the secularism, because it also assumed that secularism has to be against invocation of religion in politics. Now, in the case of religion, in liberal and left framework, it is about the Hindus and Hindutva. And Hindus and Hindutva has to be by extension primarily Brahmanical, and therefore subalterns, OBCs, Dalits, tribals have to be on the side of the secular. Now, this is an erroneous and mistaken assumption. Whether it was done deliberately or without realizing the core nature of Hinduism and Hindutva, one has to understand that the popular Hindu religiosity was never text-based Brahmanical religiosity. It was always folk religiosity. It was always the religiosity wherein a deep resonance was there among the OBCs, Dalits and the tribals. So what we can call folk or the subaltern religiosity, that was always the popular religiosity. So you start from the Bhakti movement to the kind of Hinduism that is celebrated in vast majority of Hindu society. Every caste have their own specific gods, deities, religiosity, their embeddedness. Now, if you have a very reductionist textual reading of Hinduism, in a Dumonian sense, Louis Dumonian sense, and you reduce Hinduism primarily to Brahmanism, then you are missing the real space and the resonance of Hinduism as such, the popular religiosity. So this was one mistake that the left and liberal framework did to the study of the core nature of Hinduism and Hindutva. What we witnessed that when Hindutva, which is the political interplay with the discourse of popular religiosity, it became the mobilizational plan. It did not follow a Brahmanical or a textual plan. It preferred a popular religiosity. And therefore subalterns, Dalits and OBCs automatically felt more related. Because if you look from the ideological frame, subaltern and Dalit needs to be secular. Why? Because ideologically Hinduism and Hindutva is Brahmanical. But if you go through the bottom up, that is everyday experience based frame, experience of the subalterns, then Hinduism and religiosity is about the popular religiosity, which doesn't believe in any binary called Brahmanical and non-Brahmanical. Popular is always embraced. Even a Brahmin priest or the Brahmins in village side embrace the popular Hinduism compared to the textual Hinduism. So there is a shared icons, experiences, and that is why when Hindutva is becoming the mobilizational plan, certainly it is embracing something which is popular religiosity, and therefore subalterns have to be the core of this. And automatically, because in democracy, if you have the numbers, if you constitute the significant numerical presence, and if your discourse is the part of the framing that Hindutva is offering for political mobilization, inclusivity, representation, and a new grammar of politics, certainly the Dalit religiosity is also going to be the core part of it. And that is why Dalits are indispensable to the discourse of Hindutva.
So, you talk of two different ways in which Dalit politics has played out. One was the Gandhian way, in which it was integrated with the larger Hindu society, and other was how Kashiram, Ambedkar, and later Mayawati championed autonomous Dalit voice. But of recent, we have seen that Mayawati has been on political sidelines, and some can even argue that she has been sort of co-opted by BJP. Would you agree with this assessment? And then where does alternate for like autonomous Dalit voice, or for a political party like BSP and a leadership like Mayawati lie?
Now, whether Mayawati has been co-opted by BJP or not, this is something which is the response depends upon particular event, particular. So, if she joins the alliance with the anti-BJP India alliance, say for example in 2024 election, this charge would be kind of completely vanished with her. But if she refuses to join the opposition alliance, then certainly this charge is leveled. But we have to see the vantage point through which these charges are being framed. Now, what is more important that why do we see? There is no doubt that both BSP and the leadership persona of Mayawati has undergone intense degree of decline, at least electorally. The question is why? The foremost reason among many others happen to be that today we need to see what was the prime plank of BSP. 1980s onward, when BSP 84 it was founded, and after 1990s it started having popular resonance, electoral success, some setback, but in 2007 it culminated in coming to the power, a first Dalit party which came to the power on its own, anywhere in India. Now, up to that point, the prime plank of BSP, or the kind of politics that Mayawati was representing, was inculcating a sense of self-respect among the Dalits. I think that purpose has been served and fulfilled. And it is the achievement of the BSP that it created a base for a post or a kind of Dalit politics beyond self-respect, because that is not sufficient now, that has already been achieved. So the fact that BSP succeeded in fulfilling its prime or the core objective triggered a new kind of Dalit politics, which is the politics of aspiration. What today we witness is the emergence of a young, which is, we also have a Gen Z among the Dalits. People always think that generational identity is mostly about the metropolitan youths, etc. So the Dalit youths, late millennials or Gen Z, what you call, they are quite aware in the age of information. They have access to social media. They have aspiration, but because of their relatively weaker position, materially weaker position, they are also filled with deep sense of anxiety. So we see a matrix of aspiration and anxiety. Anxiety because you know that what aspiration you have may not be fulfilled because of the structural limitations. So this politics of aspiration emerged precisely because BSP fulfilled the ground conditionality. Aspirational class emerges when your sense of the self is confident, and that politics of self-respect created that ground, or created that favorable condition wherein a Dalit today is seeking to be aspirational. Now, once Dalit frame moves from self-respect to politics of aspiration, BSP should be credited for creating the groundwork, but BSP is now not the best claimant of the politics of aspiration. So the achievement of BSP also is partly responsible for its electoral and political decline. Because once you created the ground for the politics of aspiration, and we see the emergence of an aspirational Dalit community, we do not see that these Dalits are treating BSP and Mayawati as the best party and the best leader. And therefore you are aspirational like any other community. Brahmins dominant intermediary communities, mercantile communities, they all are aspirational, and therefore you see they keep on experimenting. For example, in UP, you see Brahmins since 1990s up to 2022, they alternated from Congress to BJP to BSP in 2007 to Samajwadi Party in 2012 to BJP again, and they are continuing like that. So why should we expect a Dalit always to be beholden and united behind one party and one leader? Aspirational communities are always fragmented. Why? Because there are multiple claimants. You cannot say that there is one authentic identity and other is all spurious identity. There are competing authentic identities today. To some, Ramnath Kovind may not be an authentic Dalit, but that is just one assertion. There is a counter assertion that who determines what is authentic, what is not. So today it is very difficult. So fragmentation of the Dalit identity today that we have discussed in our book also, wherein you have Hindutva centric Dalit identity, you have a anti-Hindutva Dalit identity, you also have within Ambedkarite frames a leader like Mayawati, who is more patient, more institutional, more long-term, more issue-based, bound by certain norms and ethics. And then you have politics of the impatience, politics of everyday assertion within the Ambedkarite framework, led by Bhim Army and so many other young Dalit icons like Chandrasekhar Azad, Sajjan Kumar, etc. So within same ideology we see the fragmentation. Why? Because this aspiration has made the Dalit youths looking for multiple avenues, multiple parties, multiple ideologies, multiple anchors who they feel from their vantage point being best suited to them. So fragmentation is leading to the decline of the Mayawati and BSP. Fragmentation happened because BSP failed the prime objective of self-respect. Now, what is the alternative to a party like BSP and a leader like Mayawati? One thing is that is central, that we are not going to witness in near future a consolidated discourse of Dalit politics that we witnessed in 1980s. That entire UP, you will have one prime Dalit party led by a leader. That phase is over. So we are going to witness a new era of Dalit politics, which is about fragmentation. Now, within fragmentation, we see leaders like Chandrasekhar Azad, or say for example Sajjan Kumar who are lesser known, or Daddu Prasad in Bundelkhand. There are competing anti-Hindutva leaders who are leaders of protest and movement. They are not leaders of elections. So a Dalit on the ground is mixing pragmatic and normative. That is everyday experience and ideology together. So suppose there is a Dalit who needs to create pressure on the government or in certain offices, government agencies, certain outlets, so that some of the Dalit centric issues gets resolved very soon. Now BSP has abandoned the movement part. Mayawati doesn't come on the streets. She doesn't lead the protest. So that time a Dalit will call a leader like Chandrasekhar Azad and Bhim Army, or Ambedkar Jan Morcha in Purvanchal, or Sajjan Kumar, or for example Daddu Prasad in Bundelkhand, etc. Because they are the ones who are needed when you needed to protest, when you needed to create pressure, when you needed to assert and create some sort of movement. The same set of Dalits will be mobilized. But the moment elections will come, the same set of Dalits will think that they are not going to win because their winnability is very limited. So here comes the pragmatic, and they will look for a party which they think is more utility based, or more they are sending more resonance and outreach, and then you will find that majority of them may prefer either the BSP or the BJP or some other party. And that is why you see during Hathras incident, where a Dalit girl was raped and killed, while the majority of the Dalit protested, immediately when the elections happened in Hathras constituency, BJP won by a margin of more than 1 lakh, around 1 lakh 10,000. Why? Because many of the Dalits also said that we do not consider Azad as a leader for elections or pragmatic discourse. He is there for protest and movements. Then they also made another distinction that we do not consider a crime which is societal crime as a political crime. So for example, many of the Dalits said that ये तो हमारे साथ होता रहता है, these things keeps on happening. So to allude it to the party in power, that is BJP, may not be the correct position. So something which is a social problem cannot be automatically linked to the ruling party. And that is why we find that today Dalits are having a very complicated and layered but very clear articulation, complex articulation, wherein to protest they have a new set of leaders. To engage they have multiple ideologically they are divided, but to vote they have a completely different kind of constitution. So we are going to witness a future post BSP phase of Dalit discourse wherein there would be new set of parties and actors for the politics of protest, but there would be new set of, and perhaps it would be the mainstream parties when it comes about politics of preference, electoral preference, policy based preference, and we are going to witness a fragmentation of Dalit identity on generational line, Mayawati versus Chandrasekhar Azad. Along the caste lines, you have the Jatu Chamars versus other castes. Then also along ideological lines, wherein a section is moving towards Hindutva, while a section is remained within Ambedkarite frameworks. So fragmentation is the new reality, and we are not lamenting it, we are celebrating it, because fragmentation means the assertive, confident middle class is now confident to experiment. So fragmentation of the Dalits should not be seen as a crisis for democracy as is projected if you frame it from a left and liberal framework. This is something which signify that a Dalit today is confident to experiment with multiple options and choose the one which he or she thinks is going to give him the best leverages. So fragmentation is the alternative to DSP.
I have many questions. So is Chandrasekhar Azad like the representative of the new aspirational Dalit voice, and he's working in Uttar Pradesh mainly, which also has CM Yogi Adityanath, who has portrayed, he has a persona of a masculine warrior, like that's his political style. So how does this new aspirational Dalit voice stand in comparison, and especially the persona of Chandrasekhar Azad, who has himself like portrayed himself as another masculine warrior-like persona? How do they compare?
Yeah, one of the things usually it's different identities, but the frame of the politics is shared. There is a common identity. For example, it's a competing masculinity, but this masculinity is also something which, when it talks about protecting the women, against the lawlessness, against the atrocities. So Yogi Adityanath is credited with providing a relatively much better law and order framework wherein women on the ground are feeling safer, particularly the women belonging to the weaker section. That's the truth. But the underlying, if you look from the ideological perspective, there is also a deal of very patronizing masculine frame which emerges as a protector. Now that may not be problematic for the weaker section, because what they need is a raw security against the raw insecurity. But the same frame is also shared by the new assertive Ambedkarite leaders like Chandrasekhar Azad. Take for example, and this is the question we asked him head on, and we did not find a clear answer to that. When Chandrasekhar Azad mocks Mayawati for not being brave enough, for being a coward who, unlike him, cannot hit the ground and lead the protest, who is not afraid to go to the jail and take the ruling regime head on, and this mockery acquires a new intensity. And the body language of the Chandrasekhar Azad, while saying that, is of a person which is a twisted moustache and very masculine body and the voice. That also a masculine gaze to a fellow Dalit leader. You are mocking a women leader for not performing or challenging on the pitch of the masculine politics. Why? Because Your aim is that vis-a-vis the masculinity that is resonated, say for example, in a very assertive leader like Modi or Yogi. It's Chandrasekhar Azad who can counter that. A woman like Mayawati cannot counter. So within Dalit discourse also, you find the subtext in Dalit assertion or in a very radical Dalit politics that is there is always being guided from a masculine frame. That is there. And that is in the politics of symbolism, his body language, the way he challenges, the semantics he uses, that's there. And this is also getting some sort of success because what we find today is the era of a decisive leadership. Majority of the women on the ground in most of the state politics, their first and foremost concern is about security, safety, not only for them. We found that in Gujarat, many of the women said that one of the reasons that Modi became a persona because compared to the pre-Modi era wherein the lawlessness was so much so, the women were afraid to send the female children to school. With a kind of a law and order frame, they feel safe. So it's a trade-off, but the trade-off is a good trade-off because for everyday discourse, the raw safety is desired. So that way, we do not, beyond the departure of the rhetoric and identity frame, we do not find much difference. It's a competing, I will not say masculinity, but some sort of masculine assertion you find in Chandrasekhar Azad also. When you compare his challenge or his mockery of Mayawati's leadership, the gender dimension is always there. So, but this is more popular also because in social media you do not want to see a leader who is not seen as decisive, as someone who is quite considered to be full of persona, and persona is about assertion, confidence, and therefore masculinity seeps in subconsciously even among the leaders who may not doing the same consciously, and that is why I think the new Dalit leaders are not apologetic even about their caste identities. Ambedkar talked about annihilation of caste. But today you see someone like Chandrasekhar Azad openly puts up a board in his village, welcome to the land of great Chamas. Guinea Mahi in Punjab, a couple of years back, there is a pop song called Danger Chama. So you are celebrating your caste identity. Why? Because annihilation of caste primarily meant annihilation of stigma attached to the caste. What they actually means is the equalization of caste. So I think one of the identity frame wherein we find a very assertive masculine quest for a leadership or the new modes of politics also because every caste and community, how downtrodden you may be at the bottom of the social pyramid. Today they want equalization, and how do you achieve equalization? By doing away or annihilating the stigma attached to the caste. Once you take away the stigma, no one is willing to let go of their caste identity. Why? Because caste identity is also your sexual identity, your cultural identity. It is the identity of your memory, your assertion, your struggle, and therefore, the quest of masculinity becomes successful because once you invoke masculinity, the destigmatized identities also becomes identities of pride and respect, and that is why ideological discourse may differ, identities may differ, but the quest of a very masculine, confident, assertive leader is increasing, and to that extent we find a commonality, be it Yogi or be it Chandrasekhar.
So this question of de-stigmatization of caste brings me to the question of religiosity. There's a difference between the old Dalit leaders like Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ambedkar, who had converted to Buddhism, and Kashiram, who had planned to convert to Buddhism. But this conversion is not the stated strategy of Mayawati or Chandrasekhar Azad. So, is there a genuine hope of ending caste discrimination in the Hindu society, or have we already reached that point where caste has been destigmatized for the Dalits in India?
Well, see, identity is a two-way process, and the question of the stigma cannot be a one-way process that I as a Dalit feels that I am not stigmatized and it will be achieved. It has to be a two-way process wherein the non-Dalits also needs to endorse. Now, to a great degree, not entirely, that project has been achieved. It's very difficult to stigmatize Dalits the way it used to be done, say 3-4 decades ago. So to that extent, stigma, it's not entirely gone, but the project of destigmatization of the caste is a grand success. Now that leads to the quest for retaining the caste identity on the plank of making the vertical division of the class is or caste, it seems like a horizontal division, wherein an equalization of the caste. Something that Gandhi and others initially believed, that if you take away the stigma, the difference between mental and physical labor that differentiated a Brahmanical caste versus the subaltern caste, etc., etc. So to that extent, equalization of the caste on the ground seems to be a greater reality, having a greater resonance compared to the academic take, which still looks at the caste through the literature offered by Ambedkar or Dumonian frame. On the ground, we do not see that Dalits are willing to let go of their caste identity, but they are certainly asserting to do away with the stigma attached to their caste. That is the popular Dalit experience and desire on the ground. Now, coming to the question that Ambedkar wanted to bring religiosity and a non-Hindu religiosity in, say, Buddhism, etc. And both Kashiram and others in their textual articulation in speeches or in their programmatic vision talked about conversion, but in reality they never went to implement that discourse. Now this brings the question of how do we understand a discourse, or for example a Dalit discourse or a Bahujan discourse. Take for this Bahujan discourse needs to be critiqued in its practice rather than the theoretical articulation. What was the core of Bahujan discourse? Dalits, lower OBCs and minority, that is Muslims. And a Bahujan consciousness in theory in 80s was also linked to the Buddhist consciousness, right? Because Ambedkar had showed the way. Were OBCs willing to convert to Buddhism even when they wanted or they became the part of the BSP? This is one no, maybe to some extent, but certainly great deal of them did not want to trade off their Hindu identity. Certainly caste identity was there, but that did not mean that political discourse also resonated with the desire for a new religious discourse. For OBC it was not. Was it a discourse which was popular among the non-Jatap, non-Chamar, or say for example non-Mahar discourse in Maharashtra? The answer is no. Matang caste in Maharashtra, they are proud Hindus. Matang, Saint Matang Rishi is there. Valmikis we know, Pasis we know, Khatiks we know. Initially they were galvanized by the Bahujan discourse, but there was no desire for a religious trade-off. Now come to the Muslims. How many of the Muslims who constituted the core of the Bahujan Consciousness Project, BSP, and which also talked about the alternate religiosity, about the Buddhism, how many Muslims were galvanized by the discourse of Buddhism? No. So, rather than a very romanticized, normative, academic frame, which is about how it ought to be, we need to see how the discourse operated on the ground. So, if you read the Bahujan literature like Ambedkar today, or some of the written statements, some of the written records, programmatic vision, it gives you a normative sense that how Bahujan consciousness envisaged a religious discourse in the form of Buddhism. But in practice, what is happening? Not only Kashiram and Mayavati did not convert to Buddhism or did not call for a conversion of Buddhism, but when there were attempts by alternate Dalit leaders to go for a mass conversion, you see that BSP in its own tenure is sabotaging, and the foremost example is Ramraj, a Khatik, when he decided in 2000, I do not remember the time, but Mayavati was the chief minister. When he decided to convert to Buddhism and he became Ramraj, from Ramraj to Udit Raj, he had planned a conversion of 50,000 Dalits. And Mayawati, as a chief minister, ensured that that attempt is sabotaged. And this is on record. So what we find in practice is not only not propagating or executing the theoretical or programmatic project of a Bahujan and Buddhist conversion, but rather sabotaging it when there is an attempt by some other Dalit force. Why was it happening? Because a political discourse is also a pragmatic discourse. The leaders who are connected to the ground, they do see the limitations. And there comes the Dalit Hindu embeddedness, OBC's Hindu embeddedness, and complete lack of Muslim galvanization with any alternate religious discourse. So it was a political alliance. The cultural, social, and normative, which is religious also, trade-off was very weak. It just succeeded in a section of the core Jatav and Chamar leadership, as was successful in Neo-Buddhist of the Maharashtra, which is just confined to the Mahatma. And that is why we find that in practice, BSP and Mayawati not only did not promote Buddhism, but rather sabotaged it.
To put more focus on New Age Dalit leader Chandrasekhar Azad, he came into prominence around the same time that student leaders from JNU gained limelight, whether intentional or unintentional. A few years down the line, we see that except for Umar Khalid, all others have fizzled out or sort of have been co-opted by mainstream and populist parties. Is that a trajectory that you also feel Azad might follow, or will he remain a symbol of anti-establishment, like not institutionalized as such, as you said earlier, like more of a form of protest? And what, in your opinion, like what are his best bet to ensure that he's able to carve out a political space for himself in the longer run?
Yeah, the parallel is interesting around 2000 post 2014, 16, or you find Saharanpur protest is happening, and suddenly Chandrasekhar Azad is coming to prominence, and JNU incident happens, and Omar, Kanhaiya, and Saila, etc. They emerge as the youths,
Icons.
And one commonality is that they all are anti-BJP, anti-Hindutva. And they all are looking at the discourse of Hindutva from a very strong ideological frame. Because there are two ways to see Hindutva. The discourse of Hindutva, seen ideologically, is still rooted in Brahmanical code, still is not inclusive, is intolerant, and in a radical frame is projected as antithesis of democratic discourse, right? And they all share this thesis, if you look from the ideological frame. Now there is alternate way of seeing it, because what you call as the discourse of Hindutva is now the popular discourse on the ground, more popular among the subaltern communities, because upper caste always voted for BJP, but BJP did not come to the power. It got catapulted to the power only when the subaltern joined. Subaltern are finding it more representative, more inclusive, and therefore more democratic. We are living into an era of Hindutva wherein for the first time in the last 7 years, since 2017, 16, 17, all the three top posts of the Republic, President, Vice President, and the Prime Minister, happens to be non-Brahmins. That is subaltern. You have a Dalit President, now a tribal President. You have a Shudra President, Venkaiah Naidu, now a OBC President. And you have a most powerful Prime Minister who also is an OBC. Now this cannot be just symbolic. When the top three posts of the Republic is non-Brahmins and subalterns. So Hindutva now gives you a different imagination, different exposure if you look from the representative frame, if you look from the inclusivity frame, right? Yes, the Muslim question is different, but if you look from the subaltern question within the Hindus, It's radically more inclusive, not only against other mainstream parties like Congress and others, but vis-a-vis other OBC and Dalit centric party. BJP not only fields more OBC and Dalit, but it also gives more representation in organization to the subaltern community. So thereby it's also radically inclusive. So these two, ideological versus the representative frame, basically, and therefore it is seen as deepening of democracy. This is one. Second question, except for Umar Khalid, we do find that all of them have fizzled out or had joined a mainstream party. Now that takes us to the question of an ideological frame of politics always starts with assertion and a quest for alternate movements. Movements are the first strategy that inspires them. They all want to create an alternate politics or a new imagination, new journey through movements. But we do know that movements requires institutional support, resource, and also to sustain it, you need to have institutional competence. And more you get involved, you realize the pragmatic compulsion of having an institutional competence. Now, the institutional embeddedness also requires the acceptability that the new actors who are having a niche of themselves in particular segment of the society, if they are brought to the fold of the institutions and alternate platforms, they will add something. You should not be a baggage or a burden. So to that extent, we find that Kanhaiya joined, leaving CPI. He already had an institution, but he has a larger presence. He went to Congress because of his pragmatic consideration in Bihar. CPI, in collaboration with RJD, did not have much scope for himself because there can be only one youth icon against BJP. It has to be the Jasvi Yadav. So why should RJD and Lalu Yadav will let Kanhaiya have a foothold? So that option was closed. So he chose a better one. At least he gets a national platform. In the case of Chandrasekhar Azad, we do find that he has not joined any party, but he also has created his own party, Azad Samaj Party. And we do know that he tried to have some understanding with Samajwadi Party in 2022. It fizzled out not on ideological or principal ground, but on the question of seat sharing. And we do know that there are mainstream party like Congress and Samajwadi Party which is catering to Chandrasekhar Azad because they all feel that once BSP starts declining, 10 to 12% of the Jatib Chamar votes is going to look for the alternative, and therein the utility of anchors like Azad will come to bear either towards non-BJP party or BJP through its subaltern Hindutva project can win over. So to that extent, I think Azad is also going to be institutionally embedded, perhaps already is, though he has not declared it. He still prefers to talk in an ideological frame. Question of Umar Khalid is different because someone like him doesn't fit into the institutional, requirement. He doesn't bring something extra. Rather, inducting Umar Khalid to most of the mainstream institutional frame is seen as adding a baggage. The baggage of the nationalist frame. Today is the time wherein you find from the mainstream left parties, CPI, CPM, to the Ambedkarite parties, to the mainstream parties. They may differ ideologically in terms of secular, communal, and all sort of binaries. But there is one consensus about the question of national frame, which is always underlying. And therein, if a person is considered to be outside the accepted nationalist frame, you are treated as a baggage. So to that extent, co-opting someone like Umar Khalid would be extremely difficult. But someone like Chandrasekhar Azad who talks about the autonomous Dalit politics but links it to the larger nation making, it becomes easier. So there is always a tacticality along with the normative frame in most of the leaders. If you abide by a normative frame which goes against the nationalist frame, in today's age of populism and social media, that becomes very difficult. So we have to see Whether you as a leader who is an autonomous voice, as a starting point, are you adding something extra? Are you bringing something plus to the institutional framework? If you are not bringing anything extra, then you are a bad batch. If you are able to bring, degree may differ, then all the leaders who emerge through autonomous politics are bound to follow our institutions.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for your nuanced and compelling views.